Even though Reverend Gillespie's 1967 visit caused less trouble for my father than Dr. Proctor's had in 1964, it would be a mistake to assume that the racial chasm in American life had narrowed. In fact, few white people, North or South, were comfortable with the notion of racial equality in the early 1960s, and the victories that black Southerners finally won, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, principally recruited legions of opponents. As the Democrats increasingly became identified with the Black Freedom Movement, white Southerners poured out of the party. Senator Josiah Bailey of North Carolina had predicted this 30 years earlier as he filibustered against 1938 anti-lynching bill. If national Democrats come down to North Carolina and try to impose your will upon us, the Negro, so help me God, you are going to learn a lesson which no political party will ever forget. Bailey's prophecy came true. In the presidential election of 1964, 5 states from the Solid South went to the Republican candidate, Barry Goldwater, who had opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Republican organizers in Dixie traded almost exclusively in racial fear and white resentment. Political developments in the North reflected the same racial impetus. The Democratic primaries of 1964. A third of the Democrats in Wisconsin and Indiana voted for Alabama's Governor George Wallace, the bellowing, slick-haired icon of Southern white supremacy. That summer, when President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, he is said to have handed a souvenir pin to aide Bill Moyers, remarking, "Bill, I think we just gave the South the Republican Party for your lifetime and mine." Johnson turned out to be an optimist. 2 traditional Democratic constituencies, white Southerners in Dixie and white ethnics in the northern suburbs, now stampeded out of the Democratic Party, launching an enduring and racially driven realignment in American politics that would eventually put determined opponents of the early 1960s freedom movement into the highest offices in the land. It is important to note that the white backlash that fueled this realignment fed Richard Nixon's Southern strategy and created the Republican Party of Strom Thurmond, Jesse Helms, Trent Lott, and Newt Gingrich. Began with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, not the riots of the late 1960s. The reaction against the African American freedom movement began much earlier and rejected not only black militancy, but also simple justice. National opinion polls taken in 1963, only weeks after Dr. King told America about his dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood, end quote, documented that anti-Negro prejudice is widespread and deeply rooted in the U.S., extending to the vast majority of ordinary, well-meaning Americans in all parts of the country. In truth, Dr. King had many admirers, but he was also one of the most widely and deeply hated men in the United States. The sugar-coated confections that pass for the popular history of the civil rights movement offer outright lies about white Americans' responses to the freedom movement instead of reminding us how profoundly it challenged American practices of justice and democracy. No one, in the rosy glow of our hindsight, was opposed to the movement except pot-bellied, tobacco-chewing racist rednecks in Mississippi. And thank God for the federal government who, in these fantasies, rode over the hill like the cavalry to iron out these little difficulties on the frontier of American society. Polling data revealed that the majority of white Americans in 1963, prior to the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, believed that the movement for racial equality had already proceeded too far and too fast. North and South, whites avoided social contact with black people and strongly objected to integrated housing and schools. Agents for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, hearing Dr. King's dream of racial reconciliation and equal citizenship, launched a calculated effort to destroy King's personal life and tried to blackmail the eloquent young preacher into committing suicide. While most Americans would not have approved of the FBI's secret campaign to bring about King's suicide, we should not forget that comparatively few of them applauded Dr. King while he lived. In the years since his murder, we have transformed King into a kind of innocuous black Santa Claus, genial and vacant, a benign vessel that can be filled with whatever generic good wishes the occasion dictates. Politicians who oppose everything King worked for now jostle their way onto podiums to honor his memory. Many of them quote Dr. King out of context as they denounce affirmative action, despite the fact that King repeatedly, publicly, and passionately